Okay, hello everybody. I'm Ralph Seliger. Richard Sassoon has helped me. Well, he's actually responsible for the style of these illustrations here that will help with the presentation. And he'll be kibitzing and filling in from his own point of view, I'm sure, as we go further, as well as getting comments from other people in the audience. Today is the seventh day and soon to be the eighth night of Hanukkah, or Hanukkah, the Jewish holiday which commemorates this period of history. It may surprise some of you to learn that it's not a major religious holiday, but it is a very popular Jewish folk holiday. To be sure, most Jews probably observe it to some degree, and it is a commandment to light the menorah, the candelabra, but even very religious Jews would not have to take off from work to observe this holiday. A significant fact about this period of history commemorated by this minor holiday is that if the priestly Hasmonean family had not led a rebel movement called the Maccabees to defeat the effort nearly 2,200 years ago to replace traditional Judaism with a thoroughly Hellenized pagan faith, Christianity would almost certainly not have emerged a couple of centuries later. And without the monotheistic models of Judaism and Christianity, it is hard to see the rise of Islam. So this rather small-scale struggle in a border region of one of the Hellenistic kingdoms that rose after the death of Alexander the Great had earth-shaking consequences for what came afterwards.
I just want to add to that it's actually a very famous, Christopher Hitchens was once asked, what is the one event in history you wish had gone differently? And he actually says this revolt, for exactly the reasons that Ralph suggests, right? Because Hitchens has a very strong opposition to theistic religions, that if the Maccabean Revolt had failed and the Hellenization process had occurred, no monotheistic faith would have survived into the modern period. So it just sort of shows you, both sides, right? Like that was what he thought about in terms of changing the course of history.
Thank you. In 586 BCE, the southern Hebrew kingdom of Judah fell to the Babylonian Empire, ending the royal dynasty that began with David. The temple in Jerusalem, built under the reign of David's son Solomon, was destroyed, and most of Judah's surviving population was forced into exile in Mesopotamia, as the song goes, by the waters of Babylon. In 538 BCE, the Persian Emperor Darius I allowed the Jews to return from exile in Babylonia.
I'm sorry, Ralph, this is Cyrus, not Darius.
Okay.
The slide is misprinted. It should say Cyrus.
Oh, okay, sorry. Anyway, this Persian emperor allowed the Jews to return from exile in Babylonia within the confines of the Persian Empire, and the temple was rebuilt on the same site in Jerusalem. About 200 years later, the Persian Empire was conquered by the Greeks under Alexander the Great. After Alexander's sudden death, his conquests were divided among his generals. Judea was contested between two powerful Hellenistic kingdoms, the Seleucid dynasty in Syria and the Ptolemies in Egypt. In the early part of this period, it was under the Ptolemies in Egypt. Judea finally fell to the Syrian Seleucid dynasty. There were as many as 8 books of the Maccabees, but only two, the first and second books of Maccabees, were based on original Hebrew texts. And they only survived in Greek translation. The second book of Maccabees is said to be a Greek abridgment of a Hebrew history. Neither book made it into the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. The first and second books of Maccabees are canonized as part of the Bible for Catholics and some Orthodox churches, but not for Protestants. The setting of the first book of Maccabees is about 150 years after the conquest of Judea by the Greeks. The Greek ruler of Syria, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, attempted to suppress the practice of basic Jewish law, resulting in the Maccabean Revolt. The book covers the conflict from 175 to 134 BCE, highlighting the struggles and victories of the Jewish rebels known as the Maccabees, which is Aramaic for hammer. Under the leadership of a rural priestly family, the Hasmoneans, Mattathias, Mattatyahu in Hebrew, and especially his sons, Judah, Jonathan, and Simon's son, John Hyrcanus. This was the Maccabee leadership in the first and second generation. After successfully invading the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt, but having been forced out by Rome, Antiochus IV captured Jerusalem and removed the sacred objects from the temple, slaughtering many Jews. In 168 BCE, he desecrated the temple by establishing pagan rituals. He forbade circumcision, the possession of Jewish scriptures, the observance of the Sabbath, and the offering of sacrifices at the temple. He also required Jewish leaders to sacrifice to idols, a sacrilege compounded by using pigs as the main sacrificial animal. Surprisingly, it was actually the Jewish high priest Menelaus who convinced Antiochus to enact these anti-Judaic measures. The Jewish Hellenists, led by Menelaus and Jason, his predecessor as high priest, were religious reformers who wanted to remove those parts of Jewish practice that were unique and separated Jews from other people, such as the dietary laws, Sabbath observance, circumcision. Some Hellenists continued to worship the Jewish God, but they moved their worship to outdoor sanctuaries and, as mentioned before, used pigs as a sacrificial animal. Portable altars were sent into the countryside. Mattathias famously began the revolt by killing a Jew who stepped up to publicly worship at such an altar. The Hasmonean family fled into the Judean hill country, where they found other Jews who were fleeing these same pagan decrees. They organized a guerrilla army of over 3,000 men, staging assassinations and hit-and-run raids, mainly against Jews who were collaborating with the Syrians. Mattathias and his sons and their followers were traditional Jews who observed the law to such an extreme that when a camp of his followers was attacked on the Sabbath, 1,000 were killed rather than violate the Sabbath by fighting. But the Maccabees soon realized that they can't be so rigid in their observance and still survive. So they introduced the practice that one could violate the Sabbath in order to defend oneself. Yet even this sensible step was a bold act of rebellion against Jewish religious authority, as the Maccabees lacked the legal standing to change the law, which was in the jurisdiction of the high priest in Jerusalem and of the Council of Elders, or the Council of State, known as the Sanhedrin. After Mattathias died about a year into the rebellion, his son Judah took over as leader, expanding the Maccabees' success as a guerrilla army. Let me see, there's some, maybe you should see some maps here, okay? So we have the Seleucid Empire, Ptolemaic Egypt, and the rest of...
Ralph, we're not seeing any of these maps. We're seeing
Really?
you.
I can see a map.
I see it.
Yeah,
I
I
see
see
it.
it too. Yeah,
Really?
yeah.
Yeah.
I see it.
You might want to configure your Zoom settings, Paul.
Yeah, maybe
that
I
might
can
be the
look at
issue.
settings. Screwy.
So, Ralph, a quick question.
Yes.
Can you talk about it a little bit, like, the hierarchy?
Ah,
Like right now we have synagogues, right, where people go to pray. At that time, when you were talking to high priest, everybody came to pray in the temple in Jerusalem, or
pray is sort of in quotes. I mean, the main method of communicating with God, so to speak, would be through animal and grain sacrifices and offerings at the temple. And traditionally, the faith was centralized in the temple in Jerusalem.
Additionally, you had a number of local shrines and altars that were located throughout Judea. There were what were called the Shalosh Regalim, or the 3 walking holidays, which are Shavuot, Sukkot, and Passover.
Those are the pilgrimage holidays.
Correct. Yeah. And those were where Jews from all across the territory of Judea would come to Jerusalem to offer their sacrifices in the Great Temple. But for the weekly sacrifices that one was expected to do, there were regional altars in the various cities and townships where Jews were living.
I'm not clear that there were. I mean, there were.
But that's the original story of Mattathias, right? Mattathias is actually at one of these regional altars, and the Greek authority says you must offer your sacrifice here to the Greek gods.
I understand what it was a portable altar, because they did send portable altars out into the countryside with a specific purpose of having the people in the countryside worship in accord with the new paganized Jewish religion.
That's just not my experience, and that runs counter to a lot of the history in the earlier parts of the Bible, where you have shrines throughout the territories.
There were earlier on, yes, but before the religion and the country was centralized with Jerusalem at its head, and of course, the Hebrew tribes and even Saul's kingdom existed before the Jews even possessed Jerusalem. So yes, there certainly were altars in the countryside at that time. My understanding is that during the Hebrew kingdom, that the religion was really rigorously centralized in Jerusalem. And that's why,
in terms of authority, it was. In terms of where you could practice it, it wasn't. You can think of it the same way as, like, for example, the Church of England during the 16 and 1700s, right? That it was centralized in London under the Archbishop of Canterbury. It was very organized in that sort of way, but it had a number of local locations, so you didn't actually have to go to London every time you wanted to pray.
Can I ask a question?
and anyway, I was just
don't
about
you mean the Ark of the Covenant? That's how they went around through the desert.
No, that's not what we mean. The to respond to Zach's question, you didn't have well, you didn't really have synagogues yet, or synagogues were just about beginning. So you know, the synagogue tradition evolved over a couple of centuries, and certainly by the time that there was no temple any longer, the ability for Jews in a community to meet at a synagogue, and that's what synagogue, that's what the meaning of the Greek word is sort of a place where people meet, and the Hebrew word for synagogue, which is Beit Knesset, is a kind of a house of meeting or a house of assembly. Yeah. So anyway,
how did they meet and prayed in Babylon captivity and after before they really built the temple?
There wasn't a lot of regimentation in Babylon in terms of how the Jews were supposed to pray. The organization of the rabbinic structure, as Ralph was pointing out, really occurred when Ezra and Nehemiah rebuilt the Second Temple. In terms of the organization in Babylon, we have very scant resources that tell us what happened. If we look in the book of Daniel, which is supposed to happen in that time, Daniel is recorded as being vegetarian, right? Because the process of proper ritual slaughter couldn't occur in Babylon. There weren't the rabbis who were trained to do it. And so that's what I would expect from the prayer style, that you would have a similar lack of regimentation. And because you didn't have the great temple, they couldn't offer sacrifices.
When the Jews were offering sacrifices, was the process similar to the way that the Greeks offered sacrifices?
I'm not sure the degree of granularity we want to go into here, but when you would, first of all, the animals were different, right? The Greeks prized pigs, Jews obviously didn't. But the way the animal was cut, placed on the altar, the blood was sprinkled on the altar. The person who was responsible for doing it in the great temple was usually the high priest, although he would be given the sacrifice physically by a penitent. You have things similar to that, but I don't know if the exact way it was burnt, for example, would be different than the Greek sacrifices. I don't know if the portions of meat that were consumed by the priests were parallel to the ones that were consumed by the priests in Greek tradition. But there were probably small similarities, but it would look like the same general process.
I think the actual practice would be, in terms of details, would be quite different, and the Israelite practice, which eventually became the Jewish practice of sacrifice, was depicted or described in the Bible. So the priests would try to be very meticulous about following those kind of practices.
Did they, in each of these cultures, did they eat the sacrificed animal?
I can't speak to the Greek, and maybe somebody else can, but in ancient Israelite culture, absolutely, that was the primary source of sustenance for the Kohanim or the priests.
The Greeks ate the animals.
Priests accompanied their sacrifices with enormous feasts.
The priests and Levites, you know, they needed the contributions of the people in order to sustain themselves, because they didn't have any, you know, in the original Hebrew Confederation, they were not allotted land to cultivate, because the thought was their function would be to run the religious affairs of the community.
So it sounds is very much practical as well as ceremonial. The priests needed to eat.
Right.
Absolutely.
It does have that aspect, yeah.
And Ralph, you had said something about practice in Israel prior to the Babylonian exile.
Yeah, we had mentioned that both of us had sort of alluded to in the First Temple period and prior to the First Temple period, the Bible records a number of different shrines. Some of these shrines are polytheistic shrines that, of course, the prophets are condemning for being polytheistic shrines, like the Shrine of Dan. Some of them are forerunners to the temple, like Shiloh, which is Shiloh in Hebrew, which is where Hannah prays for a son, which eventually is the prophet Samuel. You have a number of smaller shrines where sacrifices are offered as well, outside of the Jerusalem Hill Country. So you have this sort of mix of local votive areas and shrines in the First Temple period. As we've sort of discussed in the Second Temple period, which is what this is, you have more centralization of a hierarchical system of religion in Jerusalem, which wasn't as codified in the First Temple period, especially since during the Babylonian captivity, the Torah was finally concretized, the beginnings of the Mishnah were written, so you began to have a certain locus of rabbinical understanding that was now in Jerusalem, and you had these small local shrines for non-major holiday observances and sacrifices. The great sacrifices would now occur in Jerusalem in a more regimented way.
But you shouldn't imply that all of this was the worship of the Hebrew God of Yahweh. I mean, the archaeology shows pretty clearly that there was worship of Asherah in individual homes. They find the pillars associated with and you wouldn't see all of these diatribes against idolatry and specifically against Asherah happening in the Bible unless there were lots of people doing it, because there would be no reason to polemicize against it if it wasn't in practice.
Correct.
Absolutely, and I wouldn't want to imply otherwise. If you read,
so I'm saying don't stress the exclusivity of worship of Yahweh, because in the pre-exilic period that wasn't the case.
I think that the northern kingdom, sometimes called Samaria, that the worship of Canaanite gods was more common, but the Tanakh, various books of the Bible, yes, they inveigh against the ways in which altars were being dedicated or allowing worship sacrifice to other gods. And there were at least one or two reform movements that occurred under certain kings.
Talk about Josiah.
Josiah was one of them, probably the biggest one, of course, if we're talking about that northern kingdom of Samaria, was during the reign of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, right? You had the story of Elijah and the 450 priests of Baal, where the 450 priests were forced to prove that their God was real, and so did Elijah. And of course, because it's the Bible, Elijah prevails and the priests of Baal are supposed to be slaughtered. But in the same passage, actually, a few paragraphs later, Elijah himself is on the run, and we have record of him telling to King Ahab, there are Israelites slaughtering priests of Yahweh, and prophets of Yahweh. So it's very correct, Paul, to point out that in the First Temple period there was a lot of non-Yahweh worship going on in this territory. But by this period, almost all of the Canaanite religions and pantheons had generally disappeared. The Hellenistic religion had either co-opted them, or these people had been converted to standardized temple Judaism as codified by Ezra and Nehemiah.
All right, so Richard found this illustration of some of the kind of weaponry that the Maccabees would have used, and they must have relied on projectile kind of weapons, and I'm thinking slings probably more than anything else. But they,
yes, slings and peltasts.
A key to their early successes was the fact that they were fighting on their own turf in the hill country, and their enemies couldn't really make effective battle formations against them. I mean, basically, they'd be coming down from the hills, they'd be hitting them from all sorts of sides.
These guys were at war. These guys were at war with basically Macedonians and Phalanxes, right?
That's exactly what it is. So actually, if you go to the next slide, Ralph, for a second, to respond to that point.
Which is the next slide? Let me see.
That one. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
If you look at this area called Bet Horon, this picture is actually from a Roman battle that took place there, but the geography is very instructive here because the Jews win the engagement against the Romans as well. But this is a hill country where there's a very narrow pass, and the pass is actually incredibly windy. So you have this situation where the phalanx can't form because a phalanx needs multiple people standing in lockstep formation. And this area is only a few people wide. So it managed to trap the Greek soldiers there. And because of the bottlenecking effect of these sharp turns, the Maccabees from the higher positions over the sides of the pass were able to win a key victory against the phalanxes because the phalanxes couldn't form. Right. Whenever Judah Maccabee engaged with the Seleucid Greeks on open territory outside,
he was in trouble when that happened.
He was smashed into the ground, and you can see that actually from the battle on the left side, which was a battle that Judah Maccabee engaged in with Maccabees several years later on an open plain, and the Macedonians brought in their phalanxes, exactly as Howard pointed out, but also they brought in elephants from the eastern provinces, from what was Persia, and the Maccabees had absolutely no idea how to deal with the Persians. The only person who attempted to take them down was Judas's brother Eleazar. And as you can see there, the way he chose to do it was to stab the elephant in the underbelly. And when he did that, he did take the elephant down, but the elephant crushed him to death.
Right.
So you can see that there were not a lot of people who were willing to take up that method of victory.
Yes. So here we see the major parts of what you might call the land of Israel at this time. Galilee, Samaria, Judea, and the map that's simpler, but has a lot of place names in it. You could find some of the names of the battles, of the battle sites. The Maccabees first defeated a Syrian force in 167 at the Battle of Ma'ale Livona. I think that's probably not here, actually, for some reason. And not much detail is known about it, but Judah is supposed to have killed the Syrian Greek general Apollonius and taken his sword, which he is said to have used the rest of his life. The following year, the Maccabees won another victory at Beit Horon, launching a surprise attack on the enemy encampment at Emmaus. We see Emmaus here, and Beit Horon is nearby. While most of their force was looking for Judah's army higher up in the hills, the Maccabees burnt their camp. They attacked and burnt their camp, and so when the rest of the soldiers returned to the camp and they saw it in flames, they fled in panic.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Right. So if you actually go to that slide that we were previously on, number 10.
Let's see. No.
Number 10.
Oh, okay, sure. Thank you.
If you look in the lower right-hand corner, you can actually see this is the Ialone Valley, where the city of Emmaus is on the northwestern side, and there was another town called Mitzpe on the northeastern side. Hellenized Jews in the town of Emmaus told the Greeks that were encamped there that the Jews were in Mitzpe, which was correct intelligence for the time. And the Greek divisions started moving towards Mitzpe and into the mountains to try and seek out where these Jews were. As soon as they got to the town of Mitzpe and found out that the Jews weren't there, right? So first they go to the town, they see the Jews aren't there, they go into the mountains because they expect the Jews to have been hidden there. Meanwhile, the Jews actually circle around back, and as Ralph pointed out, they raided the Greek camp, which was incredibly disheartening to the Greek soldiers because now they felt like they were chasing a phantom.
And I also want to point out that these were victories over second-rate troops who were mostly levies and auxiliaries from various parts of the empire. So even calling them Greeks is perhaps taking some liberties. I mean, obviously there must have been some Greeks there, and their commander Apollonius probably was Greek in some sense. Now, the Seleucids took the rebellion more seriously after this, dispatching an army under a high-ranking official and general named Lysias. He positioned. Let me get back to that. Here we go. Lysias positioned his army strategically at the fortress of Beit Zor, to the south of Jerusalem, about 30 kilometers to the south of Jerusalem. It's not clear if there was an actual battle, but there was a multilateral negotiation that went on. It included Lysias, Judah, the high priest Menelaus, and a Roman envoy. Rome had recently established itself as the #1 power in the Western world by conquering the Hellenistic kingdom of Macedonia. The Roman envoy took the Maccabees' side in the negotiation. All agreed to request that the king and the anti-Judaic religious decrees, that he end the anti-Judaic religious decrees, and for the rebels to return to their homes in safety. The king was preoccupied with a military threat to the east, so he was happy to amnesty the Maccabees and end the conflict. The high priest Menelaus was the loser, as he had instigated the conflict in the first place, but his party was still in power in Jerusalem. Toward the end of 164 BCE, after a few months at home and taking in the harvest, Judah renewed his war against Menelaus and the party of Hellenizing Jews. Judah's army stormed Jerusalem in a sudden attack. The city's capture was not that hard, as its defensive wall had been taken down a few years earlier by Antiochus. But Antiochus had also built an inner fortress known to us as the Acra, manned by Seleucid garrison, where Menelaus and his followers fled for safety.
Slide 12.
Thank you. You know them better than I do. Here we go. So you see where the Acra is situated in Jerusalem, and you get a little sense of it.
As a quick note to those of you who might not recognize that map of Jerusalem, the old city has a completely different shape now than it did then. And in fact, most of the areas that you can see that are part of the southern part of the old city are actually part of New Jerusalem today, but it's the Arab neighborhood of Silouan in East Jerusalem. Sorry, there was a question that I cut off.
Would you know why some Christians don't believe about the Maccabees?
I'm not aware of any Christian.
Actually, I think
Okay.
Christians, certainly, by the way, some of the churches have canonized the first and second books of the Maccabees. Do
You know what?
they actually give a lot of respect to the Maccabees' history.
Yeah,
So
the church really liked the books of the Maccabees because the Maccabees are the first recorded martyrs to monotheistic persecution. So
Right.
the early Christians were at great efforts to try to show that they had antique roots. They were disrespected as being an innovation. And so they would point to the Maccabees as being the predecessors, the first people that experienced martyrdom for their belief in the one God.
And certainly the composer Handel, when he made the oratorio Judah Maccabeus, he was showing a tremendous amount of respect for the Maccabees.
I'm just curious where the question might come from. Like, are you asking like why don't they have it in the Bible? Are you asking?
I guess a little bit of both. Yeah.
Okay, in terms of why because in most Christianities, it is a part of their Bible. The only two that come to mind where it's really not the case are the Ethiopian Tawhido Church, where the books of Maccabean are something that is particular to Ethiopia, and so they have 3 books of Maccabean, and because it had the same similar sound as Maccabees, they didn't include them because it was just an issue of confusion. Then on the other side is the Protestants, and the Protestants throughout the Apocrypha, of which the book of Maccabees is amongst other books, right? Like the book of Sirach or the books of Esdras or the additional Psalms. There are a number, the book of Tobit. There are a number of these books that are together considered the Deuterocanon or the Apocrypha. And the Protestant churches considered those additions to be part of the machinations of the Catholic Church. So when you started having the development of Protestant Christianity, they threw out these books as a group, not because of rejection of the tenets of any particular book, but because of the way the church had integrated them into the Bible.
So at this point,
but they are true then. In other words,
I don't know what that means. What do you mean when you say that it's true?
Well, this really happened. In other words.
Sure, but there's a lot of, I would say that as Ralph said earlier, there's more evidence that the story of Hanukkah happened than that the story of the Exodus happened, than that the story of Joshua's conquest of Canaan happened. If you're of the view that if in the Bible, just because the Bible says something, it makes it historically accurate, that's not a view that most historians take. That's a religious perspective. I don't know that there's any Christian there's certainly never been a Christian that I've met who believed that the Maccabees and that revolt did not take place, or did not take place primarily as discussed in the Bible of there being a Syrian Greek government that repressed Judaism, that there was some kind of revolt and they established a dynasty. I'm unaware of any Christian who rejects that narrative.
So if this was in the Bible, it would be in the First Testament, is that right?
It's in the Deuterocanon. So in truth, the Catholic Bible, if we're using the Catholic Bible, has 3 components: the Old Testament, the Deuterocanon, and the New Testament. So it's in the Deuterocanon.
I see.
You mean Deuteronomy?
No. It's called the Deuterocanon. Deuteronomy is part of the if I'm going to use the Catholic system because that way I don't have to keep jumping between sects. The Catholic system has the 5 books of the law, right, as the first 5 books. The 5th book of the law is Deuteronomy, Deuteronomos, the second law. Right. Then once you move out of the Old Testament under the Catholic perspective, you start moving into the Deuterocanon, meaning the secondary canon, right? Deutero just means 2, right? So the Deuterocanon are a number of these secondary books. Once you get out of this Deuterocanon, then you move into the New Testament in terms of historical chronology, right? Because the Old Testament covers until roughly about 400 BC. That's the latest date in the Old Testament. Then from 400 BC or so until, let's say, 50 BC, that's the time period of the Deuterocanon. From 50 BC to, let's say, about 200 CE, that or 280. This is the period of the New Testament.
Let's
But you're
let's-
saying this is in the New Testament?
No,
Gene,
it's not in the New Testament. It's not in
But
the Old
that's the
Testament.
time
It's
period.
between these
Oh,
testaments. There are
I
three
see.
sections of the Christian Bible.
yeah,
Right.
let's move on. So, when last we met our hero Judah, he had just captured Jerusalem, and they entered the temple. They rededicate it, they reconsecrate it, so that ritual sacrifices can begin again. The festival of Hanukkah was instituted by Judah to celebrate this event. 8 candles of the menorah lit progressively by a 9th candle during the 8-day holiday symbolize the story of a divine miracle, that in reconsecrating the temple, a 1-day container of oil lasted 8 days until more oil could be supplied. Of course, this is on the level of religious faith and not historical documentation. And this is also why oily foods like potato pancakes and jelly donuts are treats associated with this holiday. But there was still a decades-long struggle for Judea to gain complete independence. Let's go back timeline. Okay. Judah had Jerusalem's walls and other fortifications rebuilt. In 163, Antiochus Epiphanes died of illness after suffering a military reversal in Persia. Judah took advantage of Syrian inattention during this time of transition to besiege the Hellenizing party in the Accra. Here we go. But this finally caused the Syrians to react again. The general Lysias, who had so recently negotiated with Judah, was now guardian to the new Syrian ruler, who was a child. Lysias personally returned at the head of a first-class army, laying siege to the Maccabee fortress at Beit Zur. Judah's army attacked Lysias' camp, but was defeated there by the superior Syrian force, which included 32 war elephants. Where are the elephants? Here we go.
And yeah, I was going to say.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. You've got to coach me with a number that's right, because I'm not as familiar as you are with the order of these things. All right. So Lysias. What happened in the battle is that Judah's army attacked Lysias' camp, but was defeated there by these superior Syrian troops. Where am I? One of Judah's brothers, Eliezer, Lysias had 32 war elephants in his army, and Eliezer saw what he thought was the biggest elephant, and he was under the mistaken impression that the king was, that the new king was on top of this elephant. So he figures, look, I'll kill the elephant. Maybe he knew he'd be crushed underneath it. He was certainly willing to sacrifice himself, and that's exactly what happened. But in point of fact, the king wasn't on this elephant, and the general Lysias wasn't on this elephant, and Lysias' army proceeded to win the battle. Okay, so Lysias captures the Maccabee fortress at Beit Sor, and he pursues Judah into Jerusalem, besieging what remained of Judah's forces in fortifications on Mount Zion. Judah's situation looked hopeless, but once again, events elsewhere in the empire diverted Syrian attentions before Lysias could totally finish off the Maccabees. On his deathbed in the east, Epiphanes had named another general, Philip, as regent for the new child king. So Lysias hastily made peace with Judah in order to rush off to defend his position in the imperial capital in Antioch. More than simply saving Judah and the Maccabees, this peace agreement provided for the execution of the high priest Menelaus and the complete defeat of the Hellenizing reform faction that he led by royal decree. A new high priest with impeccable genealogical credentials, being of the Zadokite family lineage, Alcimus, was appointed and now ruled Judea as an autonomous realm within the Syrian Empire.
Just a quick note, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Hebrew, Zadokite is the Hebrew rendering of Sadducee, which is the Greek rendering, right? So this is actually the beginning of the Sadducees as a politically powerful faction that eventually will show up in Jesus's time.
Yes, well, the Sadducees, you could call it the priestly political party or political movement. Okay, so Judas' retirement, it turns out, was short. He certainly didn't like to be retired, evidently. So when Antiochus V, the next king, was overthrown by his cousin Demetrius I, Judah reappeared in Jerusalem to challenge Alcimus, alleging that he was not pure enough in his Judaism. Again, the Maccabees swept their Jewish enemies before them to dominate the countryside. Eventually, Demetrius sent the Syrian general Nicanor in support of Alcimus. Nicanor was joined by a Syrian force, but he mostly commanded Jewish troops who again proved inferior to the Maccabees. Nicanor was defeated and killed at a place called Adasa. Here we are. Here's Adasa. And Judah again took Jerusalem by force and emerged as master of Judea. Judah sought out Rome's support for Judean independence from the Seleucids, and he did in fact get such a treaty from the Roman Senate. But this prompted Antioch to send a Syrian army commanded by the general Bachides. How would you pronounce that?
Bachides.
Bachides. Okay, and joined by the high priest Alcimus. The Maccabees were unable to stand up to the formations of a professional Greek army once again. Most of Judah's 3,000 men melted away, but Judah chose to fight on with the remaining 800 men and died in battle in April 160 BCE. His followers were tracked down and executed in large numbers. His brother Jonathan, actually, I think there's we get a lineage of, yeah, here we go. Okay, this is a Maccabee lineage. So we have Jonathan here. No, Jonathan here. Okay. So Jonathan inherited the mantle of Maccabee leadership, but they were reduced to a band of outlaws, a band of brigands. About 4 years later, in 156, he made peace with the Syrian government, or rather, the Syrian government chose to make peace with him, which rewarded him with what amounted to a sheikdom of a village named Michmash. But in 152, the Syrian king Demetrius I was hard pressed by a pretender for the throne named Alexander Belus. Demetrius called upon Jonathan to recruit Jews to fight for him. But Jonathan was not above taking advantage of the king's weakness. So he occupied Jerusalem and allowed Alexander Belus to bid for his support. The position of high priest had been vacant for 7 years following the death of Alcimus. Following the Greek custom of the secular power appointing religious authorities, Alexander named Jonathan the new high priest, even though he was not of the Zadokite family and therefore had no claim under Jewish law and custom. Ironically, the successor to Judah the Maccabee, whose cause was to save Judaism from Hellenism, had now become a Hellenistic prince, and he sent Jews to fight in Seleucid dynastic battles. At one point, he sent the king 3,000 men to suppress a rebellion in Antioch. They happily burned, plundered, and killed people in the pagan capital to their heart's content. Jonathan was personally caught up in one of these conflicts, captured and murdered by a pretender to the throne in 143 BCE. His brother Simon, who had become governor of part of the coastal plain and provided Judea with a port by stationing a Jewish garrison in the pagan city of Jaffa, then became head of the Hasmonean clan. I want to do, okay, so here you see, this is basically the coastal plain, and then you go up to the hill country. Jaffa, this is really a modern map. So you see Tel Aviv, but you don't see Jaffa, which is actually part of Tel Aviv today. But Jaffa would be around where Tel Aviv is. So Simon and now was the head of the Maccabees party. Simon grabbed hold of the important fortresses in Judea, which had previously eluded them. Let's see here. Beit Zur, Gezer, and finally the Akra in Jerusalem. Simon further expanded Judea's borders by incorporating the entire coastline from Jaffa to Ascalon, near what is now the Gaza Strip. Oops, sorry. And well, here, okay, this is a pretty good map. So Simon became the Hasmonean leader who obtained the title of ethnarch, prince of the people. So at this point, Judea was a kind of Hellenistic princedom. But a few years later, there was another round of warfare between the Maccabees and a Seleucid monarch, Antiochus VII. In the meantime, in 134, Simon was murdered by his son-in-law and succeeded by John, that is Yochanan, Hyrcanus. If we want to go back to here, okay. Jerusalem was again besieged by the Syrians and forced to surrender in 133. Hyrcanus had to relinquish most of the territories that his father and uncle had captured in previous years. Let's see, sorry. I just want to get an overall map of the area again. Well, that's one map.
If you go to slide 14, you can see a comparison map.
Okay, okay. Antiochus VII died in a military campaign in the east, and Hyrcanus spent years again expanding Judea's borders. Hyrcanus led Judea for 30 years until his death in 104. His fortunes as a ruler and war leader waxed and waned, but by 110, there's another map that I like that, excuse me. This is the one that shows Judea in the middle with Samaria and the Galilee.
Page 7.
Not the, oh yeah, that's right. Thank you. Absolutely. Okay. Hyrcanus was an immensely consequential leader for the Hasmoneans. By 110, he had conquered Samaria, destroying the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim. The Samaritans were people who more or less were also descended from the Hebrews, from the original Hebrew kingdoms, but they developed as a rival religious and political movement. So Hyrcanus really destroyed.
Sorry, just quick question.
No, I was gonna say that's not accurate. What it actually was is that when the Assyrians deported the population of the north during their conquest, which ended in 722 BCE, they moved populations from other parts of the Assyrian Empire to replace the Israelites they had deported. And those Israelites, those Assyrian moved peoples that were not themselves Assyrian, those peoples began to take on some of the religious beliefs of the area that they moved to, as just because they interacted with those kinds of things. So they formed that religion, and that religion is Samaritanism.
And can I
okay. Which has some relation to the Israelite religion.
Yeah, do they use the Torah, the Samaritans?
They have their own Torah?
They have a version that it's basically the 5 books of Moses. I can't swear to you that it's exactly the same text as the Jews use, but that's their basic Bible. Okay, so anyway, whoever they were, and actually they still exist. They're a tiny sect, there's a community in I believe it's the Palestinian city of Nablus, and there's also a community in an Israeli town near Tel Aviv. But nobody really recognizes them as Jews per se. It's not really the same religion or the same people. All right, so
you should add that there was considerable animosity between the Samaritans and the Judeans.
Very, very much so.
And you can see that reflected in the attitudes in the New Testament story, of the Good Samaritan. It was the reason it's so unusual is because no one expects a Samaritan to do a decent thing, because that was the Judean attitude.
Okay. Yes. I'm sure that's true. Okay. Hyrcanus, in continuing his conquests in the south, he conquered the Idumeans, who I believe are also known in ancient sources as Edomites, and he converted them to Judaism. Hyrcanus was succeeded by his sons, Judah Aristobulus, who only reigned for a year, and Alexander Jannaeus, also known as Alexander Yanai. Yanai is kind of a contraction for Yonatan, which is the Hebrew for Jonathan. Alexander ruled as king, minting bilingual coins in Hebrew and Greek, and he continued in the tradition of his father as a conqueror. But he mostly employed Greek mercenary soldiers, which of course would have alienated him to a large degree from the population. He captured again all of the coastal plain in the west and Transjordan in the east, out this way.
You can see more of that map on slide 14.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, so you can see some of the, if you look at the areas in sort of the second darkest red, you can see that he expanded in the north and the south and took some of those areas just north of Madaba, for example, on the Jordanian side of the Jordan River.
Now we see the episodes of history beginning with the Pharisees. The Pharisees were the popular party of the people as opposed to the elitist Sadducees, the party of the priests. The Pharisees incorporated the Hellenistic love of learning into Judaism, welcoming all men to study the law, the Torah, directly. They also took in a version of the Greek idea of resurrection. But the Pharisees were also sticklers for the law, with a tendency to criticize. At first, the Hasmoneans supported the Pharisees, but there was a sharp falling out with King Alexander Yanai, who must have had limited tolerance for criticism. When Alexander suffered a military defeat in battles with a neighboring Arab people in 90 BCE, he fled to Jerusalem. His Pharisee enemies made an alliance with, of all people, the Seleucid king of the time, Demetrius III, who sent an army that badly defeated Alexander's mostly Greek mercenary force. But seeing the return of Seleucid soldiers may have unnerved some of Alexander's Jewish enemies, who switched sides to support Alexander. When Demetrius withdrew his army, Alexander rallied and defeated his enemies. And now, this is a hard picture to grasp, so there isn't an illustration of this that I took. Alexander celebrated this triumph by carousing with his concubines while crucifying 800 Pharisee rebels and slaughtering their wives and children before their eyes as they died. So you shouldn't think that a Jewish monarch is necessarily more humane than some of the other monarchs that we've studied in history.
Ralph, do you know who reports that? Where do we know that information from?
Well, I got it from the history written by Elias Bickerman back in the 1960s.
Right. So, okay.
So
he was a great scholar.
Yeah, so it's not made up. It's
yeah, right.
Yeah,
well, I mean, the thing is, it goes to the point that we were discussing before we started recording, which is that you and I sort of have a difference of opinion about whether this was dominantly a Jewish society or whether this was dominant, like in the religious sense of Jewish society, or this was a Hellenized Jewish society. And to me, I think the more stuff that we start talking about when it comes to Alexander Yanai, when it comes to Salome, who comes after him, when we start talking about like, for example, the way that the Perushim, the Pharisees, were treated, it reads to me much more like the society was generally Hellenized, and that the Jewish element was sort of weak, if at all present, and that the Hellenized population was actually the majority population. But that to me is much easier than trying to square the circle of a Jewish king crucifying people, even when the Mishnah makes very clear that crucifixion is not an acceptable form of death penalty, that killing entire families is not an acceptable form of justice. Yeah, there are just a number of Jewish problems with this monarchy.
Richard,
Richard, I think it's a stretch to assume that Alexander Yanai committing this atrocity was very popular with the people.
Right, but I think actually a much better argument is if we go back to the Pharisees, right? The Pharisees, the way that they connected by the people was by introducing Greco-Roman style rationality into their religious discourse. If that's the case, then that kind of discourse is incredibly popular, which is not typically the kind of discourse that Judaism has had, at least on a local level. So,
Richard, I think you really have to look at the map to see what the dynamic is. that there were very fewer opportunities to be Hellenized in the area of Judea. The Greek cities were established along the coast, the polis. There was no school that offered a Greek curriculum anywhere near Judea. So the coastline, which later became Hasmonean territory by conquest, may have, then had a majority of people that were Hellenized. But the Hellenization of the people in the highlands of Judea at that point in time, it couldn't have been very big.
I disagree. I don't think that the fact that there were no school, like, let's say that I assume that your historical view of where the schools are is correct, right? That doesn't mean that people weren't Hellenized, because the majority of people weren't educated anyway, right? If you're talking about the common person, the common people, we see by the activities they perform, we see by the choices they make, we see by the fact that when Yanai produced coins, he did them in bilingual, right? Because a lot of people wouldn't have been able to read or wouldn't have wanted to read Hebrew characters.
That's different from saying that the people were already Hellenized. I certainly agree that by time you get down to Alexander Yanai, that the Maccabeans had realized that they needed to use the tools of Hellenism in order to survive, and they did that, but they didn't ever accept the philosophical view, really. But
I mean, look, Judaism evolved, and it was tremendously influenced by the Hellenistic civilization around them. And of course, the biggest innovation was that learning became a Jewish value, and they got it from the Greeks. There's no doubt about it. They also took this idea of resurrection, but that was, there were different kinds of resurrection, different kinds of approaches to that. But learning and study as Jewish values was a tremendous innovation, which the Jews took from the Greeks. But this is a different kind of thing than what you're contending, Richard.
Well, it's a question of time, because time changes. So what was on the ground in 180 BC, 160 BC, very different from what was on the ground in 140 and 130.
Absolutely, and these were, tremendously convulsive events that occurred that changed things. Howard, did you have something to say? Did you have a question or a comment?
No, I was going to remark that the name Alexander is a dead giveaway.
Well, sure. If you look at was the dynasty, the house of the Hasmonean house, you see how very quickly the names start becoming Greek, or at least partially Greek.
I mean, to be fair to the other side of this argument, the names that we're seeing in English, like John Hyrcanus, Alexander Yannaeus, these names came to us in English through the Greek names. They also had Hebrew names that they went by.
Yes, that's right.
So the name, so it's not like they're taking these names as a symbol of their Greek identity. They have Jewish names as well.
I mean, you need to have a certain amount of that just to be able to communicate with the ruling powers. I mean, if you're in the ruling circles, of the Hasmonean family, you're essentially on paper an on and off vassal of the Seleucid kingdom. You have business with them. You have to be able to conduct transactions with them. And that means that you have to have some familiarity, some access to Greek capability.
Absolutely.
And so they would take two names.
Yes. Howard, did you have something else?
Yeah, I was going to say, those names actually mean something. I'm looking at my notes on Pierce. I'm trying, but I mean, in a sense, you could name them something in Hebrew that has meaning, and somebody can translate that into Greek, right?
I think Hyrcanus is not a Greek name.
But
I'm looking at Alexander at the moment.
I wonder at the language. Were they bilingual, speaking Aramaic and Koine Greek? Knows? Were they all bilingual? Yeah, go ahead.
I would think that probably as rulers they would be fluent at this point in both Aramaic and Greek.
Yeah, rulers, yes, but I'm talking about people. What do you?
Well, I think the people were more likely to speak Aramaic. I mean,
like Hebrew as a language was not very dominant in this period.
well, Hebrew was the religious language.
Right.
Hebrew had disappeared from public discourse. Nobody was using Hebrew except for rites, for ritual.
But these were all Semitic languages. I mean, the Persians wouldn't be Semitic, but most of the other languages there would be Semitic. It would be Semitic of some sort.
First of all, the Persians were not Semitic.
Yeah,
That's what I just said.
That's what he was saying. It was sort of odd to the way.
Just
But no,
very
the
fast.
thing is that the Aramean language by about the 3rd century BCE had become, prior to the Alexandrian invasions, the dominant language, right? And the reason for that was that the Persians didn't have a linguistic institution throughout the different satrapies. And so Aramaic had sort of become the language that people used to trade throughout the Near East. So that's why it was
established by the Assyrians. That's when it became the lingua franca.
And of course, when most of these people's ancestors were exiled to Babylonia, they would have certainly have picked up Aramaic.
No, because there's a difference between Western Semitic and Eastern Semitic languages. So things like Akkadian is an Eastern Semitic language. Hebrew, Aramaic are West Semitic languages. I think Richard can.
Yeah, Arabic as well as Western Semitic. No, the Aramaic, as Paul points out, Aramaic became the dominant language of the Neo-Assyrian Empire during the later phase of the empire, and it replaced the indigenous Assyrian Semitic language, which was an East Semitic language, because of how useful Aramaic was in terms of communicating throughout the empire. Already, the Arameans have been strong traders and merchants throughout the northwestern part of the Levant. So it made more sense to just go with Aramaic instead of trying to translate everything back into Assyrian. And so you even have the case of Asarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, these great Assyrian leaders whose primary language was Aramaic. And so by the time that Alexander the Great conquered the region, almost everybody was speaking Aramaic west of the Zagros Mountains.
And the Persians had a very laissez-faire attitude. They didn't try to mess with anything that was working as long as they got their money.
Right.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's get back to the Pharisees. Now, despite this terrible thing that had happened with the mass crucifixion, the Pharisees survived as a popular movement and a political faction. On his deathbed in the year 76 BCE, Alexander transferred royal authority to his wife, Salome Alexandra. And it's said to have advised her to reconcile with the Pharisees, probably because they were so popular. She appointed their oldest son, Hyrcanus II, to serve as high priest. But the real power was in the hands of the Pharisees. They were able to exercise this power because Alexandra allowed them, for the first time, to be appointed to the Sanhedrin, the Council of State, which had previously only seated priests and lay nobles. With this kind of power, the Pharisees executed Alexander's counselors who had advised him to stage that monstrous mass crucifixion. Still, anti-Pharisaic elements remained, consolidating themselves around Queen Alexandra and her second son, Aristobulus. When the queen died in 67 BCE, civil war broke out between Aristobulus and his older brother, Hyrcanus II, who was legitimate successor. Aristobulus won, and Hyrcanus renounced the throne, but not for long. Hyrcanus, advised by the Idumean convert Antipater, the father of the future King Herod, allied himself with the Arab Nabateans. In the spring of 65, Aristobulus was besieged on the Temple Mount by Hyrcanus and his Arab allies. In the meantime, the Roman general Pompey was winning victories in the region, becoming a decisive presence. The Romans decided in favor of Aristobulus, with the mere word of this decision causing the Arab coalition to disperse. But the disputation of the two brothers continued before Pompey in Damascus in 63 BCE. Pompey lost confidence in Aristobulus and ordered Roman forces to occupy Jerusalem. Hyrcanus opened the city's gates to the Romans, and their joint forces laid siege to Aristobulus's soldiers on the Temple Mount. In the fall of 63, this alliance overwhelmed Aristobulus's men. In the slaughter that ensued, the Romans even cut down the priests and Levites at the altar as they engaged in performing their usual ritual sacrifices. You could just imagine the scene. It would make quite a movie, I think. Judea was now a vassal princedom under Rome. Hyrcanus II reigned as high priest, but not as king. Judea lost all of its non-Jewish territories. Let's go back to. Okay, we could do with this. Judea lost all its non-Jewish territories, losing its access to the sea and most of Transjordan. It still included Judea, Samaria, the Galilee, and Idumea. In other words, more or less here. In 40 BCE, Hyrcanus II was overthrown by a Parthian invasion in league with his nephew Antigonus. 3 years later, Antigonus was overthrown by the Romans, and Antipater's son Herod was made king. Herod married Mariamne. Let's go back to the dynasty, and we're down here. So Herod married Mariamne, also known as Miriam, a granddaughter of Hyrcanus II, and made her brother Aristobulus, another Aristobulus, the high priest. In the year 30, Herod executed the retired ex-ruler Hyrcanus II, his wife's grandfather. In the following year, he struck down his wife, accusing her of being unfaithful. Then he killed his wife's mother, Alexandra. In the year 25 BCE, he had even the distant relatives of Hyrcanus tracked down and murdered. And so the Hasmonean clan was almost literally drowned in blood. And that was the end of the Hasmoneans. I do have some thoughts, some of which I've shared already, but let me see what I've got here. As we've seen, most of the battles waged by the Hasmoneans or Maccabees were against other Jews, and toward the end against each other. They began as rural fundamentalists who violently attacked the more cosmopolitan Jews who mainly inhabited Jerusalem. In this way, they bore some resemblance to the Taliban's victory in Afghanistan recently, with their Jewish enemies being entirely dependent upon a foreign military power whom they served as armed auxiliaries. The Hellenizing Jews, who allied themselves with Assyrians, were more cosmopolitan than the Maccabees, but the price of admission to the predominant Greek culture of the time was to surrender any semblance of Judaism as we'd know it. These were not truly the ancient equivalent of today's progressives advocating tolerance and multiculturalism, because they were not defending the right of people to practice or not to practice Judaism as they chose. It would be a foolish misconception to parachute modern values into the ancient Middle East. Sorry, Richard.
I disagree. I don't disagree with the reason for your excluding it. I do disagree that it's not applicable. But
okay.
Anyway.
Let me finish, and then we'll have more discussion. Most Jews were known in the Greco-Roman Hellenistic world as backward rural hicks who made tough soldiers. So Jewish mercenaries served one or other contending party in a struggle for the Seleucid Syrian throne. Judea won its independence in large part because Syria became absorbed in dynastic civil wars. The Hasmonean priestly family that led the fight for Judean independence eventually took complete power, becoming not only the high priest, but also eventually taking the kingship. Reestablishing the monarchy in this way is regarded as a usurpation, according to Rabbinic Judaism, because the kingdom of ancient Judah had been ruled by the Davidic dynasty. The family line descended from King David, which was overthrown by the Babylonians. Rabbinic Judaism is the more mellow offshoot of the Pharisaic Judaism that dominated Judea during the Hasmonean and Roman periods. It is the stream of Judaism, that is Rabbinic Judaism, that still defines what we regard as the Jewish religion today. After the sacrificial cult of the priestly caste ended with the Roman destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE. The Hasmoneans soon became a Jewish version of Hellenistic kings. They took on Greek names and fought bloody wars. John Hyrcanus conquered the neighboring country of Idumea or Edom and forced its people to become Jews. And from the conquered Edomites arose Herod, who married into the Hasmoneans and, as apparently a paranoid psychotic, wiped them all out. It is for these reasons that neither the first nor second books of Maccabees were canonized as part of the Hebrew Bible. The Hasmoneans also sought the countervailing protection of Rome against the Syrians, a course of action which eventually resulted in Judea becoming a vassal kingdom within the Roman Empire, and later to come under direct Roman rule. Then there were the two great rebellions against Rome, that of 66 to 70 CE, chronicled by Josephus, which resulted in the destruction of the Second Temple, and finally, the failed Bar Kokhba rebellion about 60 years later, which ended ancient Judea as a country entirely. And so ends my presentation, but not our discussion. So the floor is open.
Very nicely done, Ralph. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very
Okay,
nice.
great. What about some slides down there?
Yeah.
Any
Why don't you
important?
go to slide 13?
Okay.
Because one of the things that sort of Ralph didn't mention as much, he mentioned it towards the beginning, is sort of how the holiday of Hanukkah developed. Yes, there was the lighting of the menorah that the rabbis discussed, but the rabbis discussed this almost as an afterthought. It's not something that was actually in the book of Maccabees. The rededication of the temple and the glorification of returning to Jewish ritual sacrifice it's mentioned, but it's not actually discussed as the miraculous phenomenon of the oil lasting 8 days, right? This is actually a rabbinical rejection of the Hasmonean dynasty. And Ralph touched on this a little bit when he talked about the massacre of the Pharisees under Alexander Yanai, and when he touched upon the rabbinical general antipathy towards the Hasmoneans, considering them usurpers. But the rabbis really did not want to accord the Hasmoneans the military victory for liberating the Jews from Hellenistic and direct power influence. They wanted the Jews to feel that it was actually God's hand, and so they actually interpolated through the Talmud and later sources this story of the lighting of the candle, the lighting of the candelabra that survived. In the same vein, because it doesn't have a basis in the list of holidays that are specified in Exodus, Numbers, and Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, it doesn't have the same degree of religious significance as the Jewish holidays that are. Purim is the other major holiday, for want of a better term, which has the same level of lower religious significance that Hanukkah has, in that they come from later stories in the Jewish people's experience.
I read that Judah is almost forgotten for over 1,000 years. That in fact, the personage of Judah becomes celebrated again in Christian societies, where somehow they embrace the Maccabee cause. It's quite interesting, and so we kind of naturally have handle right Judah Maccabees.
The other thing that I want to talk about is the dreidel. You can see the boy spinning that top in the upper right hand corner.
Oh yeah.
The word for top in Yiddish is dreidel. The word for top in Hebrew is sevivon. In English, we've just used the Yiddish term because of the Ashkenazi influence on the English Jewish terminology. But the dreidel was actually something that developed, at least from the rabbinical culture, developed during the Roman occupation, and that this was a way to teach kids Hebrew letters without actually studying Torah, which was a violation of Roman law, as the Roman Empire became more and more colonial in its acquisition of Judea. I also wanted to touch on another reason that the rabbis rejected the Hasmonean dynasty that Ralph didn't bring up, which is that in the ancient kingdom of Israel, the Davidic kingdom of Israel, there was a clear delineation between the high priest and the ruler of the Davidic dynasty, and that the ruler of the Davidic dynasty could never be the high priest because from a lineage perspective, right? All the high priests had to come from Aaron's lineage. All the kings had to come from the Davidic lineage. They couldn't be the same person, and even if you had a marriage, that person could not preside over both functions. And while I wouldn't go as far as to say that it was a Montesquieu separation of powers, that was definitely the way the rabbis understood it, that nobody could have both spiritual and temporal control. And they had this view at roughly the same time as St. Augustine of Hippo, writes The City of God, and perhaps even 100, 200 years earlier. So the theocratic element here, where there is a fusion between the religious leader and the terrestrial leader, is something that the rabbis strongly objected to. And it's one of the interesting things that even the most messianic Jewish movements of let's build a third temple and reinstitute the sacrifices, even those Jewish movements don't want the chief rabbi or the high priest of that third temple to be the ruler of the Jewish state.
Can I make a comment on that, Richard?
Sure.
That historically, that actually was the case from the end of the Persian period through till the conquest by the Hellenistic armies. So the law in Yesu, which is the Persian province that was Judea, was the Davidic Torah.
Actually, that's kind of true. But of course, you weren't.
But the governor of the satrap wasn't the same person
No,
as the high priest.
What I'm saying is that in other words, in Greek political thought, there were two types of polities. There was a polis, a city-state, and there was an ethnos, which meant a people, a nation. So the Jews were an ethnos, recognized as that, and they basically maintained the same form of government, which was theocratic government, passing it from the Persians to the Greeks, and maintained that theocratic status, and really up through this period of the Maccabean Rebellion.
But of course, the high priest would not be either king or governor, as Richard pointed out.
But there was no king or governor.
Right, exactly.
In the Persian satrap?
No, well, I'm saying that the Persian satrap was there representing the interests of the great king, but he didn't really, the whole idea was to let the thing work as long as they don't make trouble. And they had the franchise. That's my point. Had the franchise from the Persian monarchy. And they passed that on and got the franchise first from Antigonus Monophthalmos, then from Ptolemy, then from Seleucid.
So the political leaders as such, since they were totally under the Persian Empire, they wouldn't have had a lot of autonomy to do much.
They basically ran all of their local affairs.
Yeah, it was
domestic. There was no intrusive, of Persians into the way you operated. As long as they, didn't make trouble, paid what they were required to pay, and kept the peace,
and provided the levies for the military.
Right, whatever the terms were of their deal, they had, as I say, they had a franchise. They
had no foreign policy.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. But that was the status of everybody in the great empire. That's what it meant to be in a great empire.
Yeah, but once you were dealing with a country that was emerging as more independent, of course, that's when the separation between the high priest and the secular ruler, as it were, became more significant, because the power that you were talking about was greater, was more important, was more significant. I think the rabbis really did have a criticism of making the high priest into the secular ruler.
Oh yeah, no, I'm not saying that the rabbis agreed to any of this. The rabbis were coming from a completely different place 500 years later.
But they would not have had a problem with Ezra and Nehemiah.
There was always an ambiguity in Judaism, I think, between the attitude of it's good for Jews to stand up, and it's also bad for Jews to make trouble, and it's in stories in all through the Torah. And the story of Shechem, when Judah and his brothers, their sister, gets raped, and they kill all the people of Shechem, and Jacob disowns him because you don't make trouble like
that. There's actually a picture that I wanted to show. It doesn't seem to come up on the slides here. So if you give me a second, I can present it on mine.
Would I have to get out of this?
I'll take care of it.
Okay.
While Richard is showing this picture, thank you so much for doing this. This was really incredible, very detailed, interesting, and thank you for Richard for all the additions. Then when Richard's finished with picture, maybe you can answer one question: that when did the anti-Semitism in Greek world occurred, or you can speak about it in general? I know about the Appian, right? And then the Josephus wrote against Appian, but that was much later than the period we're talking about.
I think that if we're talking about anti-Semitism in the Greek period, it's less about Jews in particular and more about Hellenization as a project. And it's just the Jews don't fit into this project. I don't think that it's like, for example, in Christology and in Christian belief and in Islamic belief, there are specific allegations of what Jews do that are problems, that are horrendous, whatever. And so the Jews need to be hated because the Jews do X. It's more in the Greek world that the Jews don't do that the Jews don't assimilate, right? That's the problem.
Hey, Richard, is that the same for the Romans as well? Because, the Romans occupied Israel. So was that the same attitude that they had?
Well, the Romans weren't polytheistic for the entirety of their run.
Right.
So the anti-Semitism that we see in the early part of the Roman period, let's say when you have the 4 Jewish revolts, most of that is concentrated on why won't these people assimilate? Why won't these people accept Roman government? Right. It's not like it. You don't. Maybe I am not acquainted with the right sources, but I generally don't see Roman sources saying things like, "I can't believe Jews are sacrificing to the god Yahweh," or the idea of cutting the foreskin is so inhumane that we need to take care of these people. Right? Greeks didn't do it, but they didn't see like what the fundamental issue of it was.
Actually, I think the first really recorded instances of anti-Semitism, virulent anti-Semitism, are from the Greeks in Alexandria. They almost annihilated the Jews in 100 AD.
But people in Alexandria rioted anyway. It was a normal thing.
But they exterminated a third of the population.
Yeah.
This is not
okay. But what was their argument? What was their argument about why they need to get rid of the Jews?
It was going on for hundreds of years. You read of Philo. Philo of Alexandria was sent as a ambassador to Caligula to complain about, they were basically setting the Jews up. And he describes the type of demagogic appeals that this guy is making to everybody, and stirring them up against the Jews. And there's talking about how, do I tell my neighbor that he must walk with a guard and things like that.
Do you know the English actress Rachel Weisz? I mean, she's a popular actress.
Yeah.
She starred in a little-known movie, and I'm kind of forgetting the name of it.
She was playing Hypatia, right?
Yes, that's right.
I can't remember the
name of the movie.
I'm trying to remember right now.
Oh, Agora.
Agora, yeah.
Agora, that's right. Yeah. And that depicts the expulsion of the Jews. It's practically the first honest to God incident of mass incident of anti-Semitism. This.
But that's moving into the Christian era. See, I'm wondering about this.
That's
hold up. Wasn't
Greek?
Wasn't the book of, you mentioned Purim as a holiday, wasn't that instituted as part of a measure against like not mass anti-Semitism, but guy named Haman, who's like the in the court.
Sure.
You're right. He tried to exterminate the Jews from the Persian Empire.
That's a legendary story. That's his story.
Sure, but
that's the story.
But Ralph, I think Hypatia had nothing to do with Jews. I mean, she was a Greek philosopher, and she was killed by Christians. It was Christians against Greeks, not Jews.
Yes, but actually it was.
He was a pagan.
But
Christians against paganism. Yeah,
I don't know.
Exactly.
Okay.
She was a Neoplatonist.
I've been reading.
All right. Anyway, we were having that question about sorry, we cut you off.
Could I?
On Purim, yes.
Look, Greg, before we get to Purim, the movie actually depicts 3 large religious communities within Alexandria.
Yes,
the
yes,
Jews
of course.
being alongside the pagans and the Christians, and the Jews are the ones that are first victimized by the Christians.
And they come for the Greeks.
I think if you read Europe's Inner Demons, is a whole thing that was intended to lead to a study of medieval of Renaissance witch hunts. But they started describing all the stuff the Romans accused Christians of. And apparently the Christians were worshiping asses and sacrificing and cannibalizing babies, supposedly. That seems to have been directed at Christians. They don't mention Jews. When the Christians got in charge, they tended to do the same thing to other Christian sects. And eventually Jews were accused of it. So there is this irrational element of Western culture where evil people meet and sacrifice babies. And that can actually be traced back to the Romans.
Yeah.
But they seem to have hated Christians, not Jews.
But do you think that maybe, like I always thought, and maybe I'm mistaken, that anti-Semitism really per se started after Rome became a Christian, Christianity became like
the state religion.
And it was because of that question, who is to blame for death of Jesus and all this stuff. I think that's kind of to me the main kind of argument about the anti-Semitism, that's what the at least since those days, that's what Jews are. Obviously, because they don't assimilate and they're different, that added up to it. But one of the main arguments against Jews, that they are the ones who did this, and that therefore they're bad. And then
I would say that in addition to that, in addition to that, the early church had other reasons for hating Jews, right? They wanted to distinguish themselves from the Jewish community. They wanted to make clear what their religion was, especially when courting the Greeks. But yes, I don't think that categorized antipathy of Jews as Jews. I mean, I guess Paul disagrees here, but that categorized hatred of Jews as Jews was really a thing prior to Christianity. But I feel bad for cutting off somebody's question. So
what I'm saying about that is that when you say that Alexandrians and Greeks and Christians, the Christians are also Greeks. Their language was Koine Greek.
Oh yeah.
So what all I'm specifically saying is that there was a specific thing that went on in Alexandria that seemed to be there before the birth of Christianity. And then the people who became converted to Christianity in Alexandria first got rid of the Jews and then got rid of the pagans.
Yeah.
But aren't we conflating what I think when people say anti-Semitism, there's almost like a very era-specific definition, right? We have a definition in the modern world, 20th century, 19th century. We have a version in the Renaissance and the granite, Inquisitions and the kind of Spanish development of Spain, and then we have this sort of Middle Ages and let's say all the way back to early Christianity. And I think the majority of the time when we define anti-Semitism, we really mean it through those channels versus, I think when you get into antiquity, the definitions, number one, they just did not see the world the way we would in sort of political modernism and identity modernism. It was much more Hobbesian in survival. And if you saw a group that had incredible continuity and political reinforcement to itself, lasting centuries, I mean, that was a threat. And obviously, for 1,000 years, that was, the Hebrews, the Jews, et cetera, the Israelites. And I just think that's a different version than any version that we would know of in the last, 500 or 1,000 years.
But I would argue that the term anti-Semitism the term Christ killer would have no meaning to the ancient Romans. And the second thing is the Romans put down revolts with absolute savagery. It could be Jews. It could be Jews revolting. It could be Buddhists revolting. It could be haberdashers revolting.
I don't know what ancient Romans you mean, but the ones that later on, like in the 4th century, in the 5th century.
Yeah, but by that time they're Christian.
Right. Yeah, that's what I mean. And that's when the whole thing of anti-Semitism, that Jews living only in diaspora at that point, and they're surviving as a cohesive group in different places, but that's when those Romans at that time, I mean, there is a question who prosecuted the Christ. I mean, all the Gospels are basically, to some degree, exonerate Romans that they were just like used by Jews, influenced. Yeah, that's right. Which to me, historically is incorrect. I don't think Romans ruled like that. But anyway, the whole thing comes when those canonical, Gospels were accepted. I mean, they were chosen because they put a blame on Jews, and that's when the whole thing started. I think.
Yeah,
that's
I agree. I agree with Greg. There's a New Testament scholar named Elaine Pagels who has said the same thing, that the nucleus of that kind of anti-Semitism is in the New Testament itself.
Yeah, I think it would have been terribly embarrassing for the Roman Empire that had just adopted Christianity as their state religion to when you look at the story of Jesus and the Roman involvement in it, they would have every incentive to blame the Jews as much as possible and themselves as little as possible.
I mean, I think that the formalization of the New Testament happened long before the Christians were really ascendant in Rome in terms of what people were reading in the churches, because that's how the canon was made. It was, what are you reading on the churches? And these passages came up when Paul was going to the Greeks and trying to convert Greeks, because the religion of Jesus, the ecclesia, the early church, was not popular in Judea. So they looked for converts elsewhere, selling, oh, by the way, I know you're a Roman citizen and your empire is evil, but you should convert to our religion, really doesn't work as a marketing pitch. And what does work as a marketing pitch is, those people all the way over there, they did something wrong to somebody who's really special. And by the way, he's very similar to the kinds of gods that you already worship. Why don't you just, cut down to this one? And by the way, we're going to strip all of those nasty things that they do, like cutting off their penises and refusing to eat shellfish. So I think that it was sort of the marketing pitch. While I had the floor, I also sort of wanted to bring up the picture that I showed. And for those who are familiar with the founding picture of the state of Israel, this is sort of a joke on the picture of when Ben Gurion declared the independence of the state. And in the place of Herzl, who was the founder of Zionism, they put a picture of Mattathias, and they have the Maccabee brothers sort of declaring the independence of the Hasmonean kingdom. And the sort of the underlying joke here, for those who are a little less familiar with the history of Zionism, is that a lot of this idea of Jewish resurgent nationalism played on the idea of the Hasmonean Revolt, right? That you have this great Ottoman Empire, this great British Empire succeeding it, that controlled the entire world. But here we are, these plucky little Jews, and we're going to fight for our independence and our right to self-govern. And so a lot of that sort of mental influence from the Hasmonean Revolt came through in at least the self-perception of Zionists moving through the first half of the 20th century. So there's a little bit of that joke there of like, and of course, to what degree is Israel like the Hasmonean kingdom? And I would say it's very little, but there's definitely that sort of parallel there.
You could make an argument that the Zionism of the 19th century and early and through the 20th century was very much like the early Christian movements. in terms of as a survival sort of doctrine, and a oppressor doctrine, and that and the use of imagery, the use of apocalyptic narratives, etc. And to the point that they had their own Gnostics, really. Like you look at almost Zionist Gnostics in a certain way in the 1800s and into the 1900s. I'm not saying that was like a plan. I'm just saying that might be sort of DNA to any survival identity movements when they get created. They have to take on, maybe that's sort of fundamental to the survival, or to something that can last.
Yeah, but they didn't want to take over the world like Christians were eventually.
Yeah, but I mean, early Christians. So when we say take over the world, I mean the known definition. When someone says take over the world right now,
well, the early Christians, they were preaching to bring more and more and more people. They were expanding. Jews were not expanding. They just wanted to find a safe place where they could hide. I mean, the Zionists weren't even arguing in the beginning for Israel necessarily.
I mean, so
Judea.
There was a very strong socialist Zionist movement in the late 1800s, early 1900s. That was almost not religious at a certain point in terms of how
it was mostly not religious at all. Actually.
Exactly.
Yeah, it was.
I mean, but it was certainly Jewish, however.
No, it's a survival. It's because anti-Semitism at that point was not exactly against. It was also ethnic. It was not just religious.
Yeah, guys, before we continue the our discussion, I'd like to continue it. I just want to go over some upcoming stuff. Just want kind of like before you guys drop off very quickly. Tomorrow we have Aaron is going to present 80-year anniversary of Pearl Harbor, so do join us at 7. Then Tuesday next week, Richard, which is December 7th, which is going to talk about great Ottoman conquerors.
Mehmed II and Bayezid II.
Bayezid II, yeah. Then Saturday, we will touch on sexuality in ancient Rome, not just Republic, but the whole Rome. So we'll probably take much stretcher, like Caligula and Nero and all that other stuff. Then in Sunday, we actually have modern history of EU from 1946 and forward. That's going to be Aaron. And then next week,
with Richard also. With Richard, sorry.
Next week we have on Tuesday Ottoman Golden Age, and Richard, you can speak about it a little bit more.
Yeah, so the Ottoman Golden Age will really be discussing Selim I, the Grim, and Suleiman I, the Lawgiver, also called Suleiman I, the Magnificent. And those two Ottoman sultans were really famous for reaching the height in terms of the empire's wealth, prestige, and territory. So it'll be really nice. Then these next 2 weeks are really probably the most famous Ottomans you've heard, because in the previous week we covered some lesser known Ottoman sultans. But now we're getting into the period of the conquest of Constantinople, the conquest of the Levant and Egypt on the 14th. So there's a lot of much more famous ground that we're going to be covering. So it's going to be a lot more fun, I hope.
Yes. So then to switch gears, on the 15th, we have Nurul and Dr. Sabil going to do a fourth section of the Islam 101. And he's going to be doing the Muslim Jesus, right? How they portray Jesus in Quran and Muslim scriptures. And
spoiler alert, Jesus doesn't die at the end of this book.
Here we go. So I'm trying to get more people, so
don't give away. You don't do spoilers. Yeah.
No. Well, Richard did participate quite a bit in those things. Then, if you guys want to meet us in person, and again, I don't know how many people will show up because of the fact that we have this new variant. So we're doing Whitney Museum of American Art and lunch in Sveta restaurant to kind of finish up the year. But it's not going to be the last, last or kind of like meeting on a Zoom or in person. We actually will do the next day, Rise of Qin Dynasty and Warring States in China, period.
I'm sorry, it's the rise of the Qin dynasty.
Sorry, Rise of Qin Dynasty. Just shows you how much I know. That would be presented by Alex C, and she did the presentation on the Bronze Age. So she just decided to do this one as well. So that would end December on Sunday, December 19th. Kind of have 6 or 7 items still to go, meaning like in December. And then so if you guys join us for a museum, and if I bring more people, we get a discount. And then I also need to tell the restaurant how many people are going to be in. I mean, I'm planning on, maybe at first it was very ambitious before, variant, it was about 30 people, but now I'm like not thinking it would be more than 10. So
what's the date again for that?
That would be the 18th, December 18th. Yeah, that would be Saturday. I apologize because we have presentation on Sunday. I couldn't do it Sunday. But we will probably do lunch first so that people have more time in the museum.
Zach, I see that on December 25th we had early Roman army and professionalization.
No, that moved to the 8th because of the Christmas.
Okay.
We don't want to interfere with Christmas. So, and
our very Jewish group has to be respectful.
Right.
It's not very Jewish, but maybe it is. I don't know.
Well,
it's a mixed group.
Well, we're disproportionately Jewish for whatever population you want to put us in, except for Israel. But yeah. So wait, Kevin, can you just ask the Purim question because it's bothering me so much that we can't just take care of that.
Kevin,
did we lose Kevin?
So what? Yeah. Oh, it's Patrick. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Patrick.
Sorry. Yeah. I got a new computer. I got to start Zoom, so it'll say Patrick next time, hopefully.
Unless you want to change your name.
No. So what was your Purim question?
What was my forum question?
You were saying something about Haman being the Grand Vizier and
right.
the Persians.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, right. We were talking about, people were talking about like the origins of anti-Semitism and whatnot, and I said, they said it was like, Roman Empire, or after Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire. But I also remember seeing that in the book of Esther, there was, this situation where Haman, tried to like exterminate the entire Jewish population of the Persian Empire. And I mean, isn't that really the first, example of like really codified or not codified, but like really, true kind of like, anti-Semitism massacre kind of.
I mean, I would say it would be if it actually happened. As Paul pointed out a little bit, the Book of Esther is widely considered a novelization. Just a story that got integrated into the Bible, but it doesn't actually have any historical basis. The king Ahasuerus, there's been a huge debate among scholars as to which Persian monarch he's even supposed to be. Some say it's Xerxes, some say it's Artaxerxes. So as an actual historical event, it's not reputable that way. And even within the narrative,
one comment about this anti-Semitism thing. I think we have to distinguish between this sort of persecution of the Jews by a state power versus anti-Semitism of a Jew-hating mob of the type that you get in Alexandria.
Right. No, I was literally going to say
that Alexandria thing. That's like modern anti-Semitism, right? Not this. It's not the state power coming down because they refused to sacrifice to the image of the Emperor Augustus.
Right. No, and I was going to say, even in the Purim story, the motivation for the the extermination of the Jews was that one particular Jew didn't bow down to the Grand Vizier, right? It's not that there's any. It doesn't seem throughout the empire that there's any real hatred or annoyance with the Jews as people. And even Achashverosh is more or less blameless. He seems like an incompetent idiot who just is like, okay, that sounds like a great decree, I'll sign that. So it's even within the realm of the story, I don't think it counts even from government level anti-Semitism. It's something else. Thanks.
So it's kind of like the Scheherazade story, the Jewish Scheherazade story.
Yeah, exactly. That's it very much reads like that, right? Like, in fact, even within the story, there's like, let me read the book of records to hear how this other thing went because I'm tired and sleepy, which is very Scheherazadic
I think it is illustrative of the minds of the people who wrote it. So clearly they had, anti-Semitic violence and every type of horrible thing on their mind when they were writing things like this.
Sure, but I think that's sort of emblematic of Jewish history, is like even before then, but not from anti-Semitism in the sense of what we're talking about, like a rising population saying, you make children into matzah, but something along the lines of the actual conflicts that went on that destroyed the Jewish kingdom, and now they're surrounded by all these polytheists who are like, why won't you eat with us?
Yeah, well, that why won't you eat with us is a bigger deal than you shouldn't dismiss that as being something that's the beginning of a mortal hatred. That sort of separatism. There was a riot against the Jews in Alexandria in 38 CE, so that was hardly influenced by any story about Christianity. And Jews were murdered, their notables were publicly scored, synagogues were defiled and closed, and all Jews were confined to one quarter of the city. Riots erupted again in 40 CE. It was about seeing Jews as privileged isolationists.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay.
But if you think of it, there was another religion, Zoroastrians, that had you would think of it was also believed in one entity, right? I mean, in this regard. So why weren't there, anti-Zoroastrian, sentiment, so to speak, in those days?
Well, because they were part of were there a lot of Zoroastrians in the Roman Empire? I thought they were Persian and they were usually at war with. I mean, if you got Zoroastrians living in the Roman Empire, they're agents for the enemy, for your mortal enemy, for one thing. So you might go after them, but they cause problems. Well, how many Zoroastrians did you have?
There were a lot of Mithraists in the Roman Empire, maybe, but not Zoroastrians.
How related are they to Zoroastrians? I was about to ask that.
Mithraism is a mystery cult derived from Zoroastrianism.
Yeah.
They are related.
But the Romans weren't really into religious discrimination unless the religion was causing problems.
Right. No, and Mithraism was seen as different enough from Zoroastrianism that I don't think they were directly persecuted for that.
It was very widely held in the army.
Yeah.
Another good reason for not persecuting them.
They were prosecuted by Muslims later on.
Yes. Well, the Muslims went after almost all the mystery cults. They saw them as paganism, to the extent that they existed.
Well, and also, I mean, if we're going to look at it politically, a place where you could have novelty ideas, because anyone who's into mysticism is into, there's a multivariate calculus to all the different sort of inputs that are out there, and you come up with different ideas. And so if you want conformity, you always want to shut down any occult or any kind of mystic belief system.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to introduce any multivariate calculus into your empire engine.
Well, at what point, if you read, at least I've got a King James Bible here. If I read my King James Bible and I go through the 10 Commandments, the God says he's a jealous God and he doesn't like the other gods. At what point do they decide that God is the only God and all the others are superstition?
I have a notion of that. That basically, if you read the Hebrew Bible, you'll see references that basically the Israelites had a sense that there were other gods, and early on, their belief system was that their God, the Hebrew God, only had the realm within the land of Israel. I think maybe it's when David or another hero from the Bible has to go into exile, or what he regards as exile, and he says, well, if I'm leaving the land of Israel, then I can no longer worship God. I mean, I'm going out of his realm. And I think that really radically changed after the fall of the kingdom of Judah, and you have the Babylonian exile, because the Jews make a kind of a collective decision that they're not done and their God is not done. And then, in fact, the conquest of the Hebrew kingdoms was God's hand, because the people had sinned. So they begin to have a universalistic notion of their God as being the universal God. It makes sense psychologically. You know, you have a people who are downtrodden, who no longer govern their own land, no longer even live in their own land. They begin to have a notion that, you know, if they go back to conforming to the God's commandments, that they'll be rewarded, they'll come back. And in fact, there is a return.
The dominant view, at least that I've seen in the sort of Western scholarship, is a little different from that. And it's the view that in the Israelite period, the Israelites were worshiping the Canaanite Pantheon. And you begin to see in the earlier part that there are four main deities that they worship, that they worship the entity Yahweh, the entity Elyon, the entity Abal, and the entity Asherah. And that these entities are, all four of them are worshipped rather persistently. The major fights that occurred during the prophetic period are against the worship of Baal and the worship of Asherah. And in the same time, Yahweh and El Elyon are fused into one specific entity. So then we begin the process of what's called monolatry, where only one of these divinities is to be worshipped, but the other ones are still believed to exist. By the time of King Josiah in the kingdom of Judah, King Josiah moves from monolatry to something much closer to monotheism, in rejecting Baal and Asherah completely, and discovering the text of the book, the biblical book Deuteronomy, quote unquote, discovering, which instantiates monotheistic belief. By the time that Judah is therefore taken by Babylon, because King Josiah reigned after the Assyrian conquest of the north, but before the Babylonian conquest of Judah, the principle of monotheism already existed, but the canonization of the Torah had not. So the Torah was canonized within Babylon from the four pieces, including the most recent one, the book unearthed by Josiah, quote unquote. And then once Ezra and Nehemiah reinaugurated the services in the Second Temple, Judaism was effectively a monotheistic religion.
Can I offer maybe an elaboration of that?
Sure.
In my mind, the key things are, you mentioned the prophetic period, and that's kind of the key to this. Who are the prophets? I think that the ideas of monotheism emerge in the writings of the prophets, and the prophets were real. These were historical people, right? So what I'm advancing is a theory, not my theory, that I've read, that there were competing power centers in that ancient society, which were the king, the priesthood of the temple, and the prophets. And the prophets were essentially a splinter group factionalizing within Judaism, or within Israelite society, around the idea that there was one God. And what you're seeing from the prophets and the Torah as we see it, well, not as we see it, because that you're right about that happening in Babylon, but the stories in the Torah are originally the propaganda arm, if you will, the information arm of this group advocating for monotheism in this period up to and after the Assyrian conquest of the north.
Absolutely.
Once the Jews are taken to, and the emphasis is always on non-assimilation, right? And that's why you get all the stories about, not going back to the promised land. You have to kill everybody. You have to kill their animals. You're cursed if you even use their animals. So an extreme emphasis on separatism. Anyway, I'm sorry, I kind of lost my train.
No, but that was good. Any final questions before we wrap this up for tonight?
I
great
don't have
job.
any question. I just wanted to current Hanukkah, current holiday, how much of what for example, Rolf had mentioned that they almost look like Taliban, right? Or so to speak, purists, right? So we have a second purists that were trying to almost destroy Jerusalem when the Romans attacked before the destruction of Second Temple, and almost caused the full destruction and elimination of the Jews, also to speak. How much that compares to I forget what they call them, I guess, zealots, right? How much does it compare?
You're talking about the Sakari.
Right, Sakari, exactly.
There are actually a lot of similarities between the Hasmoneans during Judas's period, right? When they're fighting the rebellion, and the Sakari. Probably the clearest similarity is how small their numbers are and the fighting in the mountains. In terms of religious views, they're probably not much different because the time period is so close. There's only about 100, 150 years of difference. But I don't feel more qualified to opine than that. If somebody else has a better sense.
People ready to go. All right. Ralph and Rich and everybody, a great discussion, amazing discussion. We love these discussions, by the way, and the presentation was, just as, as advertised. Thank you so much.
Look forward to seeing you guys tomorrow too.
Look forward to see you and everybody.
Yes, look forward to seeing everybody on Tuesday as well.
Exactly.
Yep.
And I will start my presentation tomorrow with exactly where the Japanese fleet was at exactly the same time 80 years ago. So that is my goal, is to kind of take you through those couple hours also. So
all right. Good night, everybody.
Okay. Thank you.
great job, Richard.
Thank
Great
you.
job, Richard.
Great job,
Richard
Ralph.
and Ralph. Thank you very
Great job,
much.
Ralph.
Thank you.
Awesome job, Ralph.
Good night, everybody.